and welcome to the Scotichronicast, the podcast which discusses all things relating to medieval Scotland. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Buchanan. This is episode 19, and I am excited to be joined by Dr. Lucy Hinnie. This episode, we're going to be talking about Lucy's journey to studying medieval Scotland, and her work on the Bannatyne Manuscript, and how she came to work with Wikimedia. Welcome to the Scotichronicast.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining me today. Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
I'd love to. I'm Dr. Lucy Hinnie. I am currently finishing up a post as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. And as of next week, I will be the Wikimedian in residence at the British Library back in the UK, where I have just arrived after moving back from Canada at the start of the month. So it's been a weird one.
Yeah. Well, that's super exciting. I look forward to hearing more about that. Why don't you start us off by telling us how you sort of came to studying medieval Scottish history?
I love this question because it gives me a chance to think about things that have just not been something I've been able to speak about for a while, because it's been, I started at the University of Edinburgh in 2006, and I've kind of been in non-stop study since then. But the story goes a little further back than that. So I grew up in the northeast of Scotland in a small town called Huntly, which was the seat of the Gordon clan and has a little castle. It was very idyllic, very pretty place to visit. And the school I went to, it's a great little castle. It was right beside the school I went to. And at that school, in my sixth year, which is your final year of high school in the UK, I had the wonderful fortune to take some classes with a man called Dr. Klaus Yander, who was an English teacher in the English department. I opted to take advanced higher English, which is sort of like your A-level or kind of equivalent to first year of university English study. In Scotland, you can leave school after fifth year. So sixth year is, I hope none of my teachers are listening to this, but sixth year is, you can take it a little easy if there's not a lot riding on it. So I opted to take English. And for various reasons, that year was not a great year for me. But one of the best things about that year was that for 1 hour a week, we got to sit with Dr. Yander. And Dr. Yander decided that he was going to teach us a medieval module. And at that point, the Scottish curriculum was quite limited. I think you could do Chaucer or you could do Robert Henryson. But the year I did it, they switched Henryson out for William Dunbar, and Dr. Yander was slightly frustrated by this because he, in his spare time, was doing some amazing work on Robert Henryson that led to a self-published book called In Good Morality, which is a guide on how to teach Robert Henryson in high schools. I shouldn't say self-published. I believe it was actually published by the Robert Henryson Society in the late 2010s. So Dr. Yander had this wealth of knowledge and sort of no official outlet for it. So we threw ourselves, there was only two of us in the class.
Yeah.
And we threw ourselves into learning about Dunbar, and I'd never touched on any kind of literature like this before in my life. It was completely new to me. And one of the great things about Dr. Yander is he treated us with a great deal of respect. And his attitude was very much, if you come into my classroom and you want to learn, I will help you. If you come into my classroom and you don't want to learn, that's up to you. I'm here if you need my help. Yeah. And what he did was, on our very first class with him, he said, I want you to go to the library and learn everything you can about the medieval period. And I was like, oh, wow. And what I realized now is he was really preparing us quite well for university study and this idea of like go off and teach yourself something. But I remember scurrying down to the school library, which was, not a big or extensive library by any means, and just picking up some random reference books and encyclopedias and learning about things like the medieval concept of the spheres and how people thought the world was formed and sort of medieval religion. And we came back, and for 10 minutes at the end of the class, we sort of spoke about what we'd learned. And other weeks he brought in like records and tapes of sort of plain chant and things like this. So we would sit and listen to it and read these like rich, sonorous Dunbar poems. And I was just hooked. I was just utterly captivated by the way it was taught.
Yeah.
And I went off to Edinburgh University. I took a year out, and when I arrived at Edinburgh, I think I was technically accepted to do English literature and history. But I actually sidestepped out of history and into Scottish literature because I wanted to do more Dunbar and more Henryson and more Gavin Douglas. And I had the great fortune there of working with Dr. Sarah Dunnigan, Dr. Sarah Carpenter, and even the late great Ronnie Jack came in and did a few guest lectures for us. So I had this amazing, rich experience at Edinburgh of being able to take that interest and just push it further. And it became apparent to me in my kind of towards the end of my undergraduate degree that I felt that I wasn't done yet. And that path took me into the University of Glasgow, where I did my master's on Gavin Douglas and his Enneados, and then back to Edinburgh, where I started my work that continues to this day on the Bannatyne Manuscript, which kind of ties my interest in the social kind of context of Scottish literature at that time and the particulars of the poems. So that was my sort of rural Scottish path into learning more about my own culture and my own history.
Yeah.
And I feel I couldn't ever describe how grateful I feel that I had the opportunity to be taught by Klaus Yander, because he really did change the course of my life. And I always think about this. He did tell me once, and I was so stung by this when he said it, but then I listened to what he actually said. He once said, "I don't think you should go and study English." And I was like, "What? Why not? I'm good at it. This is what I want to do. How dare you?" And what he said to me very patiently was, "I'm very scared that you will stop loving it. And I think the fact that you love it is strong. And I think that's what's going to keep you going." And there have been points where I have not loved it, but I'm proud to say I've never regretted it. And I've kept that in mind when the times have been tough of like, do I still love this? Is this still making me happy? And for an educator to say that, I think is hugely important.
Yeah, that's a really good thing to keep in mind. Very important. Yeah. Well, that's cool. Yeah, it's very... it's kind of rare to have that brought up.
It was, honestly, I always felt, Dr. Yander, the clues in the name, amazing man, had done research and work on, I think William Golding was one of his first thesis works. He was originally from Germany. He'd come over to Scotland and really just threw himself into learning about anything and everything. And fortunately for me, I came in just at the kind of Robert Henryson period that really neatly dovetailed into something I became passionate about as well.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Cool. So you then started working on the Bannatyne Manuscript, and I want to learn much more about it. Most of what I know comes from what Alistair Ross wrote about it. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about your study on the Bannatyne Manuscript?
It's such an interesting manuscript, and it's interesting. I think Alistair Ross's work talks about the kind of afterlife of the Bannatyne, which is almost, I think that's a lot of people's gateway into it, because people know about the Bannatyne Club and Walter Scott's interest in the Bannatyne Manuscript. So the Bannatyne is, I think it's the largest extant miscellany of Scottish literature. It's dated, sometimes contentiously, but generally accepted to be dated to around 1568. It's compiled by a young Edinburgh man called George Bannatyne, who compiles the manuscript in time of pest, is what he writes on the colophon. So it's one of the it's uncanny that I've spent the last year digitizing this. The irony is not lost on me. Of all the things I thought would parallel my own process, I didn't think the plague would be one of them, but here we are. So it's a time, it's not the worst plague Edinburgh's ever seen, but it's one of the kind of rolling waves of plague. And he describes it in the manuscript as when we, for a work, were compelled to rest. So for whatever reason, Bannatyne is essentially in self-isolation. And we're not quite sure whether that was within or out with the Edinburgh city walls, but I would wager that it's likely out with, because he comes from an affluent family. His father's a burgess.
Right.
It seems to me that he's likely not in the kind of, he's definitely not in the Cowgate or the Royal Mile, kind of in amidst the worst bits of this infection. So he's compiling this. There are only one or two poems within it actually attributed to Bannatyne. The rest is careful copying and curating of existing poetry, including Henryson and Dunbar. What is particularly, I think, striking about the manuscript, apart from the sheer size of it, is the attention that George Bannatyne, who, by the way, is 23 when he does this, just to put everyone else's like quarantine like rituals into perspective. 23 years old, and he saves the canon of Scottish literature. I've mainly watched Netflix, but go you know, go George, well done. What he does is he actually categorizes the manuscript quite well, because in a lot of manuscript collections, there can be an element of miscellany, an element of, you know, here's a bit of medical, here's a bit of poetry, here's half of a play, and some, I don't know, little bits and pieces that I found that I think are neat and I'm going to put in this collection. So Bannatyne divides it into 5 sections: morality, theology, comedy, love, and fables. There are some categorizations that I'm a little, is that a comedy? Is that one that's in morality necessarily to be read at face value? But generally speaking, 5 strong categories, each with their own kind of interesting kind of moral structure, I think, to them. There's a sense in which I find this manuscript to be very instructive about how to live a good life, how to kind of live a moral life. But it also very much reflects the social mores of the time. And my PhD research was primarily into the 3rd and 4th sections, so comedy and love, because I was very interested in how Bannatyne represented women, and particularly this kind of idea of the debate around women, the querelle des femmes. So this idea of like, what are women worth? What do we think of them? Why do we even bother with them? They're all harlots. They're all two-faced. They're all this. They're all that. Historically speaking, I think there's an interesting context for that. And Alistair MacDonald has written quite extensively on this, in that obviously 1568, this is a Scottish history podcast. People have no doubt realised that this is sort of slap bang in the middle of the Mary Queen of Scots drama years. You know, this is kind of when things are really starting to get very rain on Netflixy for Mary Queen of Scots. That's the technical historical term, rain on Netflixy. Yes. And one of the reasons that the date is contested is that there's a substantial case for the poem actually having begun life as a collection of love poems written to kind of commemorate the marriage of Darnley and Mary, which would have been 1565. But by the time it's sort of circulating by 1568, it's changed, and sort of mentions of Mary aren't really there. It's very tacitly not, it doesn't seem to come down hard on the side of either Catholicism or Protestantism, but I would say the Catholicism has been dialed way, way back. There's very few poems in there that are overtly tied to Catholicism or tied to Mary in any distinctive way. And I think that the curious thing about this manuscript, and one of the things that really fascinated me in my own research, was the looming absence of Mary. It's like we all know she's there. We all know she's in your mind's eye. It would be like trying to write something in 2020 and not having it be influenced in any way by COVID-19. It's that sort of thing of, you must have been thinking about this, the kind of person that you were, the life you had, this must have been relevant. So it's an interesting one, because if I was Bannatyne, I suppose I would be thinking I want my manuscript to be circulated and enjoyed, and getting political or getting divisive is probably not a good way to do that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, maybe he's thinking about the kind of favour at court. Maybe he's thinking about his own links and kind of family circle. There's an excellent piece by Theo van Heinsbergen called the Prosoprography. Prosoprography? I can never say that word. Of the manuscript, and Theo's done amazing work in really getting an idea of who was in Bannatyne's immediate coterie, who would have had access to this manuscript, who we could have expected to have read it. the links that they in turn had to Mary and how that would have worked and the references within there. So it's a very juicy collection in a lot of ways in terms of both what it says and what it doesn't say. But what I've noticed is when I talk about the Bannatyne, and certainly when I first encountered it, people are kind of scared of it because it's huge. Like, I don't think there's anyone in the world who knows the whole Bannatyne. Like, even the most established academic, you can still ask them, this one poem by Henryson, is that in the Bannatyne? And they will know the answer, but it sometimes takes a minute because there is so much in there, and it's our source for a lot of poems. It's a kind of auxiliary source for a lot of very famous poems as well. But the breadth of it is so much that there just hasn't been a lot of work done on the manuscript as an actual whole, because it's a life's work. Like, I'm not going to pretend I even know anything about section 1, 2, or 5, but it to me, it's like starting to take a nibble at this like bigger apple of a manuscript and seeing where it takes you.
Yeah. So for our listeners' sake, like how big is it? Like, if you could put, like, I don't know if you have a page number or something to quantify.
I do. It has, I should know that this is the thing, I should know its vital statistics off the top of my head. I'm like, it has 2 pages. I think you're looking at around 300 folios. Wow. It's substantial. It's very hefty. It's a manuscript that I'd really hoped to have spent more time with in person, but being what it is, we have not. But it is big. It's written. One of the things that I think does a disservice to the manuscript is that it is not a particularly interesting looking manuscript. It's written in what I think personally is quite a good secretary hand. Like, I think the Bannatyne's hand is quite nice. I mean, I have to say that I've spent so much time with it, I've basically got Stockholm syndrome. Like, it's great. It's really good. But it is just text. Like, there's no illumination. There's no kind of exciting pictures of like medieval penis trees or interesting dragons. Like, it's just text. Readable text, but text.
Yeah. His cat didn't walk across the pages.
I was really hoping that might have happened, and it just hasn't, and that just sucks. You can actually, one of the things that's great and kind of links to my digitization project is that Project Europeana actually digitized it in very, very high quality images for the IIIF, so the interoperability framework, just as I was starting my postdoctoral project. So that was incredibly useful. So you can view it through the National Library of Scotland website, and in a couple of months through my own website, hopefully. But yes, it's not the most scintillating to look at, I think, and that does, I think, hinder interaction with it. One of the biggest joys, or I mean, I say joys, was I did a lot of kind of close transcription during the first lockdown period, so sort of May to July last year. And as I was going through it and making sure the pagination was correct and whatnot, I was starting to notice, like, when George Bannatyne gets tired and his handwriting gets a bit messy.
Oh, interesting.
And then when he clearly, like, has a break or goes to sleep and comes back the next day and it's all neat again. So I felt this strange kinship with him as I was, like, doing the TEI, and I was like, oh, yeah, I'm tired too. Maybe now is the time to take a break. So it's very interesting in that sense.
Cool.
I should also say that one of the things I've been working on as part of the project, I got to work with an honours student at the University of Saskatchewan who did the lion's share of the transcription of the 4th section for me, Tiana Kirstein, who is an absolutely amazing student, and we had a really great time working together for a semester looking at the manuscript itself. Tiana has an excellent eye. Her specialty is old Ukrainian manuscripts, but she has an excellent eye for detail. So it was actually really nice to have someone else to kind of go through the transcription with at that point and lament the lack of illustrations, which I probably shouldn't say because I'm a grown-up, but it, a little...
It still matters. I still want pictures in my books.
I get so covetous of these really pretty manuscripts that like the British Library will put up with amazing gilded gold leaf, and I'm just like, oh, well, not in 1560s Edinburgh, apparently.
At least not in the middle of a plague.
Yeah, but in the plague, the gold leaf was it was less available.
Hard to come by. So, what are some of the oldest things that he put in the collection?
Really great question. There's quite a lot. So I think in sections 1 and 2, there's quite a lot of religious verse. Some of which I would imagine is pretty darn old. But in terms of the 3rd and 4th section, there's definitely work by Henryson in there. There are definitely some works attributed to Chaucer, though most of those attributions are erroneous. So we're looking definitely at the kind of late 1300s, early 1400s. And then we've got stuff coming up to quite contemporary, like Alexander Scott, some work by Bannatyne himself, a poem that's actually attributed to Lord Darnley, which I think is really interesting. And I spoke about that at the MLA conference earlier this year. So it's quite a wide range, particularly for the 1560s, I think. To be looking back as far as Henryson and Chaucer is quite interesting, and does kind of make me think about what Bannatyne himself must have had access to.
Well, that's what I was gonna actually ask. Do we know, like, did he have the stuff in his personal library, or how did he get access
There's
to
an
it?
absolutely amazing article by Priscilla Bocca, and it's not about Bannatyne, it's about Gavin Douglas. And what Bocca does is she, I think in essence, recreates what the likely library of Gavin Douglas would have been. And I've always thought that's a remarkable article, and that it would be an amazing endeavour to do that for Bannatyne, because we would have similar evidence and so on and so forth. But that legwork has yet to be done. Certainly, one of the most interesting places you can look at for that is the Chaucer. And the joy, I think, is in the mistakes there, because the erroneous attributions actually give us an idea of where he was getting them from. So a lot of the Chaucer is posited to have come from, I think it's the thin printed edition of the earlier 1500s. So it's likely that he had access to a copy of that. In terms of the Henryson and Dunbar, that is slightly murkier, depending on the poem. But the key source work I tended to focus in on was the Chaucer, because that seemed to be quite a good indicator. I think it's interesting as well, because you'll notice that I mentioned a print version of a text, and Bannatyne's manuscript is scribal. So it's interesting to me that he was copying out printed text into the scribal manuscript. And a colleague, a friend, peer and colleague of mine, Dr. Liz Elliott, described it to me once as being like a mixtape almost. He's taking his favourites and collating them just because he likes them, potentially, or just keeps them all together. So I think there's a variety of sources. I wouldn't know all of them, and I think it's work that would be very worth doing. And certainly if I can find the wherewithal to continue with studying the Bannatyne, I would love to do further work on that. I think it would be really interesting.
Yeah, that would be super, super interesting. I was just thinking particularly in the midst of the pest.
What books did he take with him? What did he pack? What does he know off the top of his head, and what is he taking with him? Is he in like a country home where they have these texts? It's so interesting, to think about the context of how he was writing this as well.
Cool. So for the postdoc, you were just working on sort of transcribing it, or what was your main focus for that?
So thank you for asking that, because I like this as a question, and because it's come up a little in the last couple of months. So my project was to digitize the 4th section of the manuscript. And the 4th manuscript is around 140 poems, variety of lengths. Some are very long. There's a Hawkley's Letter of Cupid is in there, and I think it is about a quarter of those pages. It's just that one poem. And then there is a collection of epigrams, each of which is about, 4 or 5 lines. So there's a real mix in there in terms of like how long things are. So I thought the 4th section was a great place to start. A couple of reasons for that. One was my own research was focused in on that section because of its connection to gender and sexuality. And the second was that in the 1970s, Jack McQueen did a similar project of editing parts of those poems into the little, it's a very, I don't want to say cute, I mean, it's visually very appealing. It's because it's quite a small book, and it's called Ballads of Love. And it's a lot of Alexander Scott, a lot of Bannatyne material. And it's a lovely kind of handheld hardback copy that I have of it. So Jack McQueen had already kind of undertaken some of that work in his preparation for that manuscript. So the fourth section was my idea. A bit of pushback here and there. A couple of people have kind of said, but it's already been digitized. We have scans of the STS edition and images online. And to me, the importance of digitization, as I see it, is to get functional, student-friendly, student-facing editions out there of poems. Because the trepidation that we fear about manuscripts about the Bannatyne, manuscripts like the Bannatyne, is related to access, and it's related to kind of the skill sets that we train people to have. And while a PhD student or a specialised master's student might not have any problem looking at images of secretary hand, I was thinking about my own path, and I was thinking about my high school experience and my first year university experience, and thinking having access to these poems in an easy and fluid kind of way could make a real difference and could make this much more prevalent on the Scottish literature and Scottish history curricula. So to me, I wanted to have an edition that was legible, downloadable, and one, importantly, that was robust and would last quite a long time. So when I started looking into it, some interesting trivia came to light, actually. The full Bannatyne manuscript was digitized in a way by the Oxford Text Archive in the 1960s. It was actually one of the first manuscripts to be digitized by the OTA, and it was digitized for, and I'm sure plenty of people listening to this will know exactly what I mean, it was for DOST. It was for the Dictionary of the Older Scottish Tongue. It was the corpus.
Yeah.
It was digitized in a format called Cocoa, spelt like the drink, which is a very rudimentary form of TEI. And I'd had access to these files for a few years, and I'd kind of been playing around with them. And Cocoa is interesting because very few people know how to kind of use Cocoa because it's so outmoded now. And the funny thing to me is when you open it in text editor, it just looks like the manuscript is screaming at you because it's all in capitals. And it's quite stressful to look at. So it existed in a way, but it wasn't user-friendly. You had to kind of wrangle it. You had to sort of do things with it. And what was important to me was to have a digitization that, while looking good, so that anyone could click on a website and say, this is a pretty poem that I want to read. This is legible to me. Like, it's not going to hurt my eyes or make me feel unduly put upon to read this poem. It was important to me that under the hood there would be a TEI encoded manuscript that people could download and play with to do whatever they want, like textual analysis, to do, I don't know, data tagging, to look at recurrences of words, anything like that. To me, it was important that those basic parts were there because I feel that that's something that we've been lacking. So that was my aim with digitization. It wasn't simply, I want to show the images, I want to show the Scottish Text Society edition. It was to have something that could be built upon and something that could be accessible. So that was always at the forefront of my mind when I started on the work that I'm just kind of finishing up now.
Yeah, that's super important to be able to do, that kind of back end stuff.
And I think there's a question of agenda as well, because I think as a medievalist and as a lit scholar, I've got colleagues who are interested in watermarks and stamps and particular letter forms, and I find that so commendable, but it's not what interests me. Like, what's always interested me has been the actual content of the poems and like what the poems are saying. And I wanted to get it into a format where the content was being pulled to the front, so that students could see that these are poems. They're not historical artifacts that exist solely in stasis. They're artifacts that also tell us stories and also tell us things about what life might have been like then, what people understood, what people were concerned about. There's a cracking end to one of the poems. I think it's Poor Alexander Scott, where the poem just ends, Quod Scott, when his wife had left him. It's just so melancholy. Oh. It's just there. And you just think, did Bannatyne know that? Did Scott write it in his original version? Is this some shade being thrown here? Like, what's going on? So
right.
I wanted those scared, like 17, 18-year-old students and even high school students to be able to go into this text and see poems, not walls of secretary hand, and to see it as something that there is interest in. You know, we've got Wordsworth, we've got Irvine Welsh, we've got all these writers, and there are writers too in the Bannatyne Manuscript. You know, it's not something that is separate from you, and that's something I try and pull out in my teaching as well, is very much, where's the relatable content here? What can we learn from this?
Right. Oh, that's super cool. Do you have a favorite poem from this project?
I'm not going to lie, I was very tickled by Alexander Scott having been potentially dumped. I mean, I've interpreted it as him being dumped. It could be that his wife died tragically. I should really read more on Scott. To any of my old supervisors listening, I'm so sorry that I don't know the precise means by which Scott's wife leaves him. There are some brilliant poems in there, and I think my favourites change quite rapidly. And one of the things that was great about going through the transcription and the encoding was getting to see parts of poems that I'd maybe overlooked or hadn't quite got the first kind of second time round. One particular favourite that I really enjoy, and I've spoken about this, I think I spoke about it at the Edinburgh Lamp Society seminar series, is called The Wife of Auchtermuchty. And this is the sole manuscript witness of that poem. It turns up again in Alan Ramsay's Evergreen in the 1700s, which is a collection that takes a lot from the Bannatyne and then leads into Walter Scott's fascination with the Bannatyne and the formation of the Bannatyne Club. But The Wife of Auchtermuchty, to kind of praise it in a very sort of short way, it's a sitcom role reversal. It's a husband and wife switching jobs for the day to prove that, from the husband's point of view, to prove that the wife has it easy, and from the wife's point of view, to let the husband prove that it's actually quite hard to be a housewife. It's just a very comical poem. It's close to my heart because I grew up on the east coast of Scotland, and I love kind of Fife and Dundee and that sort of part of the world. And I just loved it because when I read it, I felt like this is the source of... I'm sure I watched a sitcom episode last year that had this storyline in it of, you know, man and woman swap jobs for the day. And again, Alistair MacDonald has done a bit of research into the European context of this poem, and I think he relates it to a Dutch poem of that kind of era. But it's very unclear as to whether or not Bannatyne would have ever known or heard of that Dutch poem. So it exists in this kind of timeless area, but is all at once very telling about rural Scottish life, about the kind of power imbalance between men and women, this kind of grudging admittance that maybe women don't just lay around all day. And there's just so much comedy in it. Like, you know, the man he's tasked with keeping, like, the very basic instruction is to keep goslings alive. They have a set number of goslings, and the goslings need to be kept alive. And obviously the comedic stakes are set. None of those goslings survive. Spoiler alert for The Wife of Auchtermuchty there. You know, the children are terrible. They've all wet the bed, so the sheets are awful, and they all fly down the river because he can't keep a hold of them. He can't make butter. He gets attacked by one of his cows. Like, it's just a terrible day all round. And meanwhile, the wife is just ploughing a field quite happily, like having quite a chill day, as we might say. So that one really pleases me because I think it's a poem that deserves more attention. And I like that Bannatyne included it because a lot of work has been done by critics like Evelyn Newlyn on the kind of misogynistic nature of the poems in the Bannatyne. And that's, you know, there's some vicious poems in there about women, very vitriolic, very caustic, very kind of poems that just really denigrate the status of women at that time. But The Wife of Auchtermuchty is kind of refreshing because it doesn't fall into that trap, and it sort of lets women have the last laugh while being quite an entertaining poem in itself. So I recommend checking that one out.
Yeah, sounds awesome. Yeah, cool. Do you want to say a little bit about what you're going to be starting on Monday?
I do. It's funny because I feel like this will probably come out after after Monday.
Yes,
So I'm going to be
yes, it
listening to
will.
my past self talk about this. So one of the things that we did at U of S in Saskatchewan, which was excellent. I spent 2 years working with Professor David Parkinson there, which, you know, plague aside, was a very great 2 years to have. One of the things we did was I got to teach on a course called Medieval Women. And we got to use the Bannatyne as a basis for some of that teaching. And one of the vague plans I'd always had was to do some kind of collaborative editing event. And it's ironic, but the more that things became socially isolated, the harder it got to organise online events, which is just a whole other kettle of fish, but here we are. But it ultimately was, I approached the National Library of Scotland, who have been great friends to both me and this project, about the possibility of doing a Bannatyne specific wiki editathon. And we did it. We ran it in December. It was the first time I'd ever run anything like that. And it went quite well. We all learned a lot. We've trained up a group of 14 young students to go out into the world and edit Wikipedia articles, which I think is just excellent. But when I was kind of prepping for this last summer, I became really interested in the potential of Wikimedia as a source for information, as a source for kind of open knowledge, as this way of kind of connecting people. So I kind of fell down that rabbit hole, and a post came up at the British Library for a part-time Wikimedian in residence. And as with all academia, you know, you throw things to the wall and hope that something sticks. And with the end of my postdoc looming, I thought, you know, why not? Why not see where this takes me? And to my surprise and delight, they took me on. So I'm going to be starting on Monday, looking at how to get more of the British Library's collections onto Wikimedia, how to work with sort of linked open data, and hopefully just looking at that kind of open knowledge spectrum and how to best facilitate that. I'm not sure what my first projects will be. I think the challenge and the excitement is partly that I'm going to be taken out of my comfort zone slightly. I'm going to be working with lots of different departments in different languages, different cultures, different time frames. But I'm very excited to take the skills that this Bannatyne project has given me and to apply them to different things, and hopefully be able to continue to contribute to the Bannatyne legacy in some way. You know, it's still my dream to get the full manuscript digitized, and I'm hoping that this section will serve as a kind of pilot for that, and that's something we can pursue. But who knows? If I've learned anything in the last 2 years, it's that you shouldn't plan things.
No.
Because they don't tend to happen how you think they're going to happen. So that's me back in the UK now, and yes, ready to start on Monday. Not very historical sidebar. Starting a job remotely is a strange feeling. Just walking through to your study to start your new job is going to be a bit strange, but we'll see where we go.
I imagine. Cool. Well, best of luck with that.
Oh, thank you.
Always starting a new job is always fun and interesting and a bit of a challenge, but definitely I can't imagine when you're meant to be an in-person job, but now you're starting it remotely. So
it's strange. I worry that we're all going to be very casual when we eventually do have to go into offices again. I think we were talking about this just before we started recording, like, you know, I can't wear pajama bottoms anymore. I'm going to have to make myself presentable. So it will be interesting. But, you know, the digital potential with online teaching and how we approach resources, I've felt very vindicated in my Bannatyne work, that there is an appetite for doing things remotely and for improving access. And I hope that this is a step towards that in terms of the Scottish canon anyway. Yeah,
definitely. I, living no longer in Scotland, definitely appreciate having more access to material online.
Absolutely.
So it is incredibly valuable, and there's a lot of people that are hungry for it. So
I think so. It's one of the things I've enjoyed most about getting to know Wikimedia is that a lot of people have taken up Wikimedia editing as part of their kind of quarantine regimes. So people who have retired or people who have, I don't know, just not had time to sit with their interests have actually been attending editathons and adding things and doing things. And I think that's really great. I think that's a really nice kind of pay it forward for,
Yeah.
hopefully, I'm not going to say the next time we all get locked down, because I really don't want to tempt fate, but it's not dissimilar to what Bannatyne was doing. Let's put it that way. Without being too on the nose, it's a similar ethos, I think.
I think so. I think you're right. Way to have a project that's just fits in with the time.
It's unreal. Do you know, the weirdest thing was in April, I think, I blogged about this on the project website. There was, my partner came running through and was like, your thing's on the news. And I'm like, what? No, it's not. I was like, don't talk rubbish. It's not there. But there was this article had come out. It was like a pop culture piece about the first incidence of the F word in Scottish literature.
Oh,
and they had erroneously attributed it to the Bannatyne. I think it was actually earlier than the Bannatyne. But it was strange being part of the zeitgeist for a minute. I was like, I never thought I'd see this in the news. So it was kind of fun to ride the coattails of that a little bit. And the journalist had really hit home with the kind of plague parallels. There's a lot of talk about, is it King Lear that Shakespeare's supposed to have written during plague times as well? So it was nice to see the Bannatyne getting a little bit of recognition, even if it was ill-begotten.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today and talking about your work on the Bannatyne Manuscript. It's been super exciting.
Oh, it was an absolute pleasure, Kate. Thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to get to talk about it. It's been, I don't know if you feel the same way, it's been a bit of a lonely year working on your own with things. Yeah. I've found that it's often just me and the Bannatyne, which is fine. But it does get a bit, when your closest friend is like a 450-year-old manuscript written by a 23-year-old man who you don't actually know, you do start to ask yourself some questions about whether you should be getting out more, but none of us can.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what else are you going to do?
Like, somewhere George Bannatyne smiles and thinks, yes, I prepared you for this,
The Scotichronicast is just one of many things relating to medieval history on medievalists.net. If you like what you see and what you hear, consider being a patron on patreon.com/medievalists. Thank you for joining us on the Scotichronicast. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can also follow our account on Twitter @Scotichronicast. Our music is Ex te Lux Oratur by Gaita. Thanks for listening.